In 1917, a French sergeant facing starvation in the trenches near Verdun discovered that artillery bombardment had accidentally created the most fertile soil in Europe. His garden system fed over 10,000 soldiers across multiple divisions. Allied agricultural officers documented yields exceeding anything achieved in peacetime farming. The composting method he developed worked so efficiently that NATO later prohibited similar techniques in all member military operations. At the end of this video, you will know exactly why this method was buried for a century and how to use it to cut your grocery bill in half. If you have ever wanted to understand how war transformed soil science forever, you are in the right place. Subscribe and welcome to Garden Explained with Harry. Walk into any garden center today. The shelves display bags of premium compost priced at $8 to $12 per cubic foot. Miracle Grow, Black Gold. These companies spend millions marketing soil amendments to home gardeners. Consumers pay premium prices trusting that laboratory formulations deliver superior results. They never question whether soldiers dying in muddy trenches discovered something better over a century ago. The Western Front stretched over 400 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Trench systems extended 30 miles deep in some sectors. By winter of 1916, the supply situation had become catastrophic. Soldiers required 4,000 calories daily for combat operations. They received 1,500 on good days. Sometimes they received nothing at all. Medical officers documented the consequences in field reports that military censors tried to suppress. Over 1,000 cases of scurvy appeared monthly among British forces. French military headquarters stopped publishing malnutrition statistics after newspapers threatened recruitment efforts. Soldiers developed night blindness from vitamin A deficiency. Wounds refused to heal because protein-starved bodies could not regenerate tissue. Fresh food existed. Warehouses 60 kilometers behind the lines held vegetables and meat and bread. But the terrain between those warehouses and the forward trenches had been transformed into a moonscape. Shell craters filled with water and mud. Roads disappeared under constant bombardment. Horse-drawn wagons that attempted supply runs often vanished along with their drivers. Military doctrine offered no solution. Soldiers fought. Farmers farmed far from the front. Supply officers moved goods between. No general questioned this division of labor, even as men starved within sight of soil that had grown crops for 10,000 years before the first shell fell. Sergeant Marcel Favreau looked at that soil differently. Before the war, he had worked as a market gardener outside Paris. His family maintained intensive vegetable plots using methods passed down through 4 generations of Parisian Maraîcher tradition. These market gardeners had fed the city from plots that wealthy landowners considered impossibly small. They composted everything. They planted in tight succession. They harvested year-round using glass cold frames that trapped winter sunlight. Favreau stood in a communication trench near Verdun in early 1917, and he recognized something that trained officers could not see. The artillery had done his work for him. Shells falling at the rate of thousands per day had churned the earth to depths that would have taken a market gardener years of double digging to achieve. Topsoil and subsoil had mixed together in patterns that normally demanded seasons of careful cultivation. Organic matter from destroyed vegetation lay incorporated throughout the soil profile. Trees that had stood for decades were now decomposing underground. Root systems that had built structure over generations had been shattered and distributed through the churned earth. Shell craters collected rainwater naturally. These depressions created irrigation reservoirs that required no pumping and no maintenance. Trench walls blocked the constant wind that plagued exposed farmland. The zigzag patterns created microclimates with southern exposures that captured winter sunlight and sheltered tender seedlings from frost. The destruction had accidentally replicated every condition that market gardeners spent generations engineering. Favreau recognized this because he knew what to look for. The officers who dismissed his observations had never grown food in their lives. Soil scientists would later document exactly what artillery bombardment created. In 2006, researchers Hoopy and Schetzel published findings in the Soil Science Society of America journal that introduced a term now found in textbooks: bomb turbation. It describes the mixing of soil layers by explosive force. Their analysis of former battlefields showed that shell impacts created soil profiles with enhanced water retention and improved organic matter distribution. The violence that killed millions had, at the same time, prepared the earth for unprecedented fertility. Artillery did in seconds what human cultivation required seasons to achieve. Certini and Scalengi published complementary research in Geoderma in 2011. Their analysis of Verdun and Somme sectors found nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium concentrations significantly higher than adjacent agricultural land. The measurements were taken over 90 years after the guns fell silent. The fertility improvements proved remarkably persistent. Favreau did not know these scientific terms. He knew that the soil looked right, felt right, and smelled right. He began composting using the only materials available to him. Kitchen waste from field kitchens provided nitrogen. Potato peels, cabbage leaves, and meat scraps that would otherwise attract rats went into pits dug into trench walls. Straw from horse fodder provided carbon. Bales arrived regularly for the cavalry units and transport animals. The ratio mattered. Too much nitrogen and the pile turned slimy and foul. Too much carbon and decomposition stalled for months. French military sanitation manuals documented procedures for treating human waste with lime. Favreau adapted these procedures for composting. The lime raised pH and accelerated breakdown while killing pathogens that could spread disease through the trenches. The resulting material bore no resemblance to its origins. It smelled like forest floor after autumn rain. The proportions he developed through trial and error matched what Cornell University would later establish as optimal for thermophilic composting: 25 to 30 parts carbon for every part nitrogen. This ratio creates conditions for heat-loving bacteria to multiply rapidly. Pile temperatures reach 130 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit within 72 hours. These temperatures destroy weed seeds and plant pathogens and parasites that could otherwise survive to infect new plantings. Favreau built his first garden in a shell crater behind the front line. The crater walls provided shelter. Rainwater collected in the bottom, creating a moisture reservoir. He filled the planting zone with his finished compost, mixed with the bomb-turbated soil. He planted radishes because they mature in 30 days and require minimal care. The radishes appeared on schedule. Soldiers who had not seen fresh vegetables in months ate them raw in the trench. Word spread through the communication lines faster than official dispatches. Officers who had dismissed the sergeant as distracted from military duties changed their position when they tasted fresh food. The math became undeniable. Every radish grown in the trench was one less radish that supply officers needed to transport across impossible terrain. Every calorie produced locally was one less calorie that might kill a supply driver attempting delivery. By spring of 1917, Favreau had trained soldiers from his regiment in the basic techniques. Shell craters across the sector sprouted green growth. Lettuce and spinach and turnips joined the radishes. Soldiers who had spent months watching friends die from malnutrition began eating fresh greens daily. The yields exceeded anything possible in conventional farming. Modern research confirms why. John Jeavons has conducted 40 years of bio-intensive trials at Ecology Action in Willits, California. His work demonstrates that intensive spacing combined with deep soil preparation produces yields 200 to 400% higher than conventional row agriculture. The methods derive directly from Parisian market garden tradition, the same tradition Favreau carried into the trenches. French agricultural officers documented production figures that seemed impossible to superiors who had never grown food. Square meter yields exceeded civilian farms by factors that suggested exaggeration, but the officers could taste the vegetables. They could see the gardens expanding across the rear areas. The documentation was accurate. By spring of 1918, gardens operated across multiple French and British sectors. The informal network that Favreau had initiated became semi-official. Military agricultural attachés visited successful gardens and distributed instruction sheets to other units. The knowledge spread through the same communication trenches that carried orders and ammunition. The armistice ended the war in November 1918. The gardens ended with it. Unexploded ordnance made the former battlefields dangerous for any activity requiring digging. Shells that failed to detonate on impact lay buried throughout the garden zones. Men died for years afterward when plows or shovels struck corroded fuses. The prohibition on cultivation served genuine safety purposes. Heavy metal contamination from shell casings required assessment before any agricultural use. Lead, copper, and zinc accumulated in soils where thousands of tons of munitions had fallen. Eating vegetables grown in contaminated soil could cause cumulative poisoning that manifested years after consumption. Chemical weapon residue added another layer of concern. Mustard gas and phosgene had been deployed across the Western Front. These compounds persisted in soil and could potentially enter plant tissue. No one knew the long-term effects because no one had ever contaminated farmland at this scale before. Military authorities closed the former battlefields to agriculture. The gardens that had fed 10,000 soldiers disappeared under warning signs and barbed wire. French and British agricultural agencies focused reconstruction efforts on industrial farming methods. The governments needed to rebuild national food production quickly. Industrial methods required purchased inputs, fertilizers from factories, seeds from commercial suppliers, and equipment from manufacturers. These purchases generated economic activity that helped fund reconstruction. Self-sustaining composting systems developed in trenches generated no revenue for agricultural suppliers. Soldiers built fertility from waste materials that cost nothing. They saved seeds from successful crops, and they needed no equipment beyond shovels and buckets. No company could profit from promoting these techniques. Extension services received funding from agricultural suppliers because their mandate was increasing food production. That funding came from companies that sold inputs, and the methods they promoted created ongoing customer relationships. Composting with waste materials created independent growers who needed nothing from suppliers once they had learned the techniques. NATO standardization agreements codified restrictions on military land use decades later. The protocols established consistent rules across member nations for handling former battlefields and training areas. Soil contamination testing became mandatory before any agricultural activity. The costs of testing often exceeded the value of the land for farming. The restrictions served legitimate safety purposes while simultaneously preventing transmission of the cultivation knowledge. The soldiers who developed and practiced trench gardening returned to civilian life. Some continued market gardening using adapted techniques. Most resumed pre-war occupations or entered industries that paid better wages than farming. The specific innovations developed under wartime pressure dispersed without systematic documentation. Military records remained in archives accessible only to researchers with credentials and questions. Agricultural extension focused on methods that generated commercial activity and required ongoing purchases. The knowledge existed in filing cabinets and dusty folders. It received no promotion because no economic entity benefited from its transmission. The trench composting method translates directly to backyard application. The biology has not changed in a century. The same microorganisms that broke down waste materials in Verdun trenches now break down waste materials in suburban compost bins. Start with a container or a designated ground area approximately 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. This volume provides sufficient mass for thermophilic heating while remaining manageable for turning. Layer carbon materials at the bottom. Use dried leaves, cardboard torn into pieces, straw or hay, and wood chips. These materials provide structure and prevent the pile from compacting into anaerobic sludge. Add nitrogen materials in layers above the carbon. Use kitchen scraps, grass clippings, coffee grounds, and vegetable trimmings. Fresh green materials contain the nitrogen that bacteria require for rapid reproduction. Maintain the ratio, 25 to 30 parts carbon for every part nitrogen by volume. The pile should feel like a wrung-out sponge, moist but not dripping. Add water if the materials feel dry. Add carbon if the pile smells of ammonia. Turn the pile every 3 to 5 days during the first 2 weeks. Mixing introduces oxygen that aerobic bacteria require. Turning also redistributes materials from the cooler edges to the hotter center. The goal is complete decomposition of all materials. A properly constructed pile reaches temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit within 72 hours. You can verify this with a compost thermometer or by reaching into the center and feeling heat that is uncomfortable to maintain contact with. These temperatures kill weed seeds that would otherwise sprout in your garden beds. They kill plant pathogens that could infect future crops. They kill parasites and harmful bacteria. The process that Favreau developed through trial and error accomplishes the same biological work, regardless of century or location. Finished compost appears uniform and dark, and it smells like forest floor. Individual input materials are no longer recognizable. The process takes 3 to 6 weeks depending on temperature management and turning frequency. The intensive spacing methods that produced impossible yields in trench gardens work identically in raised beds. Deep soil preparation allows roots to penetrate further than conventional tillage permits. Plants grown in deeply prepared beds access nutrients and moisture from volumes of soil that shallow-rooted plants cannot reach. Jeevan's bio-intensive research documents specific spacing for dozens of crop varieties. Lettuce plants set at 8-inch centers rather than the conventional 12-inch centers produce equivalent yields per plant, while fitting more plants per square foot. Total harvest per unit area increases accordingly. Yields increase because more plants share the same productive soil volume. Succession planting maintains continuous production. Rather than planting an entire bed at once and harvesting all at once, stagger plantings by 2-week intervals. Harvest from mature plants while younger plantings develop. The bed remains productive throughout the growing season, rather than producing gluts followed by gaps. Season extension techniques derived from Parisian market garden tradition allow production during months when conventional gardens lie dormant. Simple cold frames constructed from scrap lumber and old windows trap solar heat and protect cold-tolerant crops from freezing. Elliot Coleman at Four Season Farm in Maine has documented year-round production at latitude 44 degrees north using techniques that trace directly to the Maraker tradition. Season extension makes the growing window much longer. The economics favor home production overwhelmingly. A 4-by-8-foot raised bed constructed from dimensional lumber costs approximately $50 to $80 in materials. Filled with home-produced compost, the bed requires no annual fertility inputs. Seeds for a full season of production cost less than $30. The same bed produces vegetables worth $300 to $500 at retail pricing. The return on investment exceeds 400% in the first year. Subsequent years require only seed costs, as the bed and soil remain productive indefinitely with continued compost application. Return on a small investment is rapid and obvious. Rodale Institute research spanning 4 decades demonstrates that compost-amended soils eventually outperform synthetic fertilizer applications. The Farming Systems trial begun in 1981 shows that organic plots produced equivalent yields to conventional plots while building soil organic matter rather than depleting it. The productivity gap closes over time and eventually reverses. Research supports long-term benefits. The knowledge that soldiers developed under artillery bombardment proves adaptable to contemporary circumstances. Supply chain disruptions have affected grocery availability multiple times in recent years. Food prices have increased faster than general inflation. Families who produce even a fraction of their vegetable consumption at home buffer themselves against these fluctuations. Buffering at home reduces vulnerability. The trench gardening tradition never required patents or proprietary formulations. Favreau never filed intellectual property claims. The soldiers who expanded his system never sought recognition or compensation. They solved immediate problems using available resources and traditional knowledge that belonged to everyone willing to learn. Favreau and the soldiers shared practical solutions freely. The methods survived in military archives and agricultural research libraries. They survived in the continuing practice of market gardeners who maintained the tradition across generations. They survived in academic papers published in journals that most home gardeners never encounter. These methods survived because they worked. Every compost pile built using proper carbon and nitrogen ratios continues the biological processes those soldiers initiated over a century ago. Every intensive garden demonstrates the yields they documented while shells fell around them. Every harvest represents independence from supply chains that profit from repeated purchasing. The science is proven. The history is documented. The techniques translate directly from Verdun trenches to suburban backyards without modification. The men who developed these methods under the most desperate conditions humans have ever faced gave their knowledge freely. They asked nothing in return except that the food might help someone survive another day. The knowledge returns to common use through your hands. Subscribe to Garden Explained with Harry. Watch the next video to discover what else you can grow at home.